The first night in the new house should have felt like a victory, the reward for years of saving and months of searching. But as Daniel Harper stood alone in the empty living room listening to the silence press against the walls, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Not in any obvious way, just a quiet, suffocating wrongness that made the air feel heavier than it should have been, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The realtor had called it a rare find, a two-story home at the edge of a quiet Ohio neighborhood, recently renovated, priced well below market value because the previous owners had needed to relocate quickly, though she'd hesitated just a fraction too long when Daniel asked why, her smile tightening before she brushed it off as a job transfer. Daniel had been too exhausted from his divorce to question it, too desperate for a fresh start somewhere that didn't echo with memories. So he signed the papers and moved in alone, telling himself the unease was just stress, just loneliness, just the unfamiliar creaks of a place that hadn't learned his rhythms yet. That night he set up a mattress in the master bedroom, too tired to assemble the bed frame, and fell asleep almost instantly, only to wake sometime after midnight to the sound of footsteps moving slowly down the hallway outside his door. At first he assumed it was the house settling, pipes shifting, wood contracting in the cold, but the steps were too deliberate, too evenly spaced, the soft thud of weight pressing into the floorboards followed by a pause, then another step like someone pacing back and forth just beyond his sight. He held his breath, listening, waiting for the sound to stop, but it continued for nearly a minute before abruptly ending right outside his door. The doorknob rattled once, gently, as if someone were testing whether it was locked. Daniel sat up, his heart slamming against his ribs, every rational explanation collapsing under the simple fact that he lived alone. He grabbed his phone, ready to call the police, but the screen flickered and died in his hand despite being fully charged minutes earlier. Then came 3 slow knocks on the door, each one louder than the last. He forced himself to speak, his voice barely steady, asking who was there, but the only answer was a faint scraping sound on the other side, like fingernails dragging lightly across the wood. He didn't sleep again that night. Over the next few days, he tried to convince himself it had been a dream, stress manifesting in half-awake hallucinations, yet small things kept happening that chipped away at his denial. Cabinets left open after he closed them, lights switching on in rooms he hadn't entered, the thermostat dropping to freezing temperatures without explanation. The worst was the smell, a faint odor of damp earth that seemed to drift through the house at random times, strongest near the basement door, a smell that reminded him of freshly dug soil, and something else beneath it, something sour and decaying. He avoided the basement at first, telling himself he'd deal with it later, but on the 5th night the smell grew so strong it woke him from sleep, thick and choking, and when he stepped into the hallway, he saw the basement door, standing open despite being certain he'd locked it. The darkness below seemed unnaturally deep, swallowing the faint light from above, and for a long moment he just stood there staring, overcome by the absolute certainty that something down there was aware of him. His phone buzzed suddenly, startling him, and when he looked down he saw a notification from a number he didn't recognize, a single text message that read, "Don't go down there." He spun around, expecting to see someone behind him, but the house was empty, silent, watching. The message vanished seconds later, leaving no trace it had ever been there. Against every instinct screaming at him to run, Daniel grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the basement stairs. The air grew colder with each step, the smell intensifying until it coated the back of his throat. And when the beam of light reached the bottom, he saw that the concrete floor was covered in dark stains that looked almost black, spreading outward from a spot near the far wall where the cement had been broken and roughly patched over, as if someone had dug into the foundation and then tried to hide it. The flashlight flickered, dimmed, and in that brief stutter of darkness he heard breathing that wasn't his own, slow and wet, coming from directly behind him. He turned, but the stairs were empty. When he faced forward again, the patch in the floor was no longer intact. They searched every room, every crawl space, finding nothing. The officers exchanged skeptical glances, clearly assuming stress had pushed him into a breakdown. He moved out that same day, refusing to spend another night there, But even now in his new apartment across town, he sometimes wakes to the faint smell of damp earth and hears footsteps pacing slowly outside his bedroom door, stopping just before the knob turns with a soft, patient click, as if whatever lives in that house is still looking for him, still waiting for him to come home. When Melissa Carter bought her first home in a quiet suburb outside Portland, it felt like stepping into the life she had always imagined. A small two-story house with pale blue siding, a white porch swing, and just enough distance from the neighboring homes to feel private without being isolated, the kind of place that looked peaceful in daylight and impossibly still at night, as if time itself slowed down on that street after sunset. The previous owner, an elderly man named Walter Green, had passed away in the house according to the realtor, but she assured Melissa it had been natural causes, something she mentioned with such rehearsed calm that Melissa hadn't thought twice about it, too distracted by the excitement of finally escaping her cramped apartment and noisy upstairs neighbors. Moving day stretched late into the evening, and by the time the last box was dragged inside and the movers left, the neighborhood was silent except for the distant hum of traffic miles away, leaving Melissa alone with the unfamiliar creaks of a place that hadn't yet learned her presence. She ordered takeout, ate on the kitchen floor surrounded by unopened boxes, and laughed nervously at how loud every small sound seemed, the ticking of the wall clock echoing like footsteps in the empty rooms. The house had one unusual feature the realtor had highlighted as a bonus: a finished room above the garage accessible by a narrow staircase off the hallway, perfect for an office or guest room. Melissa had peeked inside earlier that day and felt an immediate chill despite the warm weather. The air in that room stale and unmoving, the single window overlooking the dark driveway below like an unblinking eye. She decided she'd deal with it later and shut the door, but sometime after midnight, as she lay in bed scrolling on her phone, she heard a dull thump from directly above her, followed by a slow dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across the floor. She froze, listening, her mind scrambling for a rational explanation, telling herself it was the house settling, maybe a branch brushing the roof, anything except what it sounded like: footsteps. The dragging continued for nearly a minute, stopping directly over her bedroom before silence returned so abruptly it felt deliberate, as if whatever had been moving realized she was listening. Melissa forced herself out of bed, grabbed a kitchen knife, more for comfort than protection, and stepped into the hallway, her pulse hammering in her ears as she stared at the door leading to the staircase. The knob was ice cold when she touched it. She opened the door slowly, wincing at the creak of the hinges, and flicked on the light, revealing the narrow steps rising into darkness. Halfway up, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. Faint marks pressed into the dust on each step, like footprints leading downward toward her, overlapping, as if someone had walked down those stairs again and again. At the top, the door to the room above the garage stood slightly open despite her clearly remembering shutting it. She pushed it wider, her hand trembling, and the overhead light flickered on to reveal an empty room. Bare walls, old carpet, nothing out of place except for a single chair positioned in the center facing the doorway, a chair she was certain hadn't been there before. The air smelled faintly of something metallic like rust or dry blood. She backed away, closing the door, telling herself she was overtired, imagining things. Yet when she returned to her bedroom, she found her phone lying on the pillow, displaying a voice recording she didn't remember starting. With shaking fingers, she pressed play. At first there was only static, then a low rasping breath, followed by a voice so weak it sounded like it came from someone dying, whispering a single phrase over and over: "Stay in your room." Melissa didn't sleep that night. Over the following days, the disturbances escalated, subtle at first. Doors she closed found open, lights switching on by themselves, objects vanishing and reappearing in different places. Then more aggressive. Like the morning, she woke to find muddy footprints leading from the hallway into her bedroom and stopping inches from her bed, as if someone had stood there watching her sleep. She began leaving lights on throughout the house, desperate to push back the suffocating sense of being observed. But the room above the garage remained dark no matter what she did, the bulb burning out every time she replaced it. One evening her neighbor, an older woman named Carol, stopped by with a welcome basket and casually mentioned that Walter had rarely left that room during the final years of his life, spending entire days up there alone, convinced someone was trying to get in, boarding the door from the inside until paramedics had to break it down when he stopped answering calls. Carol's smile faded as she added that sometimes, late at night, she still saw the light on in that window, even after the house had been empty for months. That night, Melissa heard the dragging again, louder than before, followed by a heavy thud that shook the ceiling dust loose. Something inside her snapped, the fear giving way to a desperate need for answers, and she marched into the hallway, up the stairs, and flung open the door. The room was empty except for the chair, now positioned inches from the doorway, as if someone had been sitting there waiting for her. The smell was overwhelming, thick and rotten, and as she gagged, she noticed deep scratches gouged into the floorboards, forming uneven lines that led toward the far wall, where the paint had bubbled and cracked. A faint tapping came from inside the wall, irregular at first, then forming a pattern that sounded disturbingly like knocking. Melissa stumbled back, but the door slammed shut behind her with a force that rattled the frame, trapping her inside. The light bulb burst, plunging the room into darkness, so complete she couldn't see her own hands. The tapping grew louder, frantic, accompanied by a muffled voice pleading from inside the wall, begging to be let out, the sound of fingernails scraping with sending jolts of panic through her chest. She clawed at the doorknob, screaming, until it finally gave way and she tumbled into the hallway, sobbing, certain something had been inches from breaking through. She spent the night in a motel and returned the next day with contractors, determined to tear open the wall. But when they did, all they found was insulation and empty space, no cavity, no hidden room, nothing that could explain the sounds. Melissa sold the house within a month, accepting a financial loss just to be free of it. Yet on the final night, as she carried the last box to her car, she glanced up at the window above the garage and saw a silhouette standing behind the glass, thin and motionless, watching her leave. The light inside that room was on, glowing a sickly yellow, even though the electricity had already been shut off. She drove away without looking back, but sometimes when her phone records audio accidentally in her pocket, she later discovers faint breathing layered beneath the noise, followed by a weak, desperate whisper repeating the same words from that first night. Stay in your room. The first thing Jason Miller noticed about the house was the door at the end of the upstairs hallway, a narrow white door with no handle on the outside, just a smooth painted surface and a keyhole positioned slightly too high to be practical, as if it had been designed to keep something in rather than keep people out. And when he asked the realtor about it, she gave a quick, dismissive laugh and said it was probably an old storage space sealed off during renovations. Nothing important, though. Her eyes lingered on it a second longer than necessary before she changed the subject. Jason had moved to the small Pennsylvania town for a new job and needed a place immediately. So he ignored the faint unease prickling at the back of his mind and signed the lease, telling himself every old house had quirks. Every unfamiliar place felt strange at first. His wife, Emily, wouldn't be joining him for another month due to work commitments, leaving him alone in the large, echoing house with nothing but unpacked boxes and the constant whisper of wind slipping through gaps in the old window frames. The first few nights passed quietly except for the usual creaks and groans of settling wood. But on the fourth night, he woke abruptly to the sound of a door slamming somewhere upstairs. The impact so violent it rattled the picture frames on his bedroom wall. He stumbled into the hallway, heart racing, and saw that the mysterious door at the end was now slightly ajar, a thin slice of darkness visible through the gap like a wound cut into the house itself. He was certain it had been closed earlier, certain because he'd checked it before going to bed, compelled by a curiosity he couldn't explain. As he approached, a faint smell drifted out, something stale and damp, like a room that had been sealed for years. He pushed the door open wider and reached for the light switch inside, but nothing happened. The beam from his phone's flashlight revealed a narrow staircase descending into darkness, each step coated in a thick layer of dust except for a single set of footprints leading downward. Jason's mouth went dry as he realized the prints were fresh. He called out, his voice echoing down the stairwell, asking if someone was there. But the only response was a faint shuffling sound from below, followed by what might have been a soft, muffled sob. Every instinct told him to back away, to call the police, yet the thought of an intruder hiding in his house pushed him forward. Halfway down, the air turned icy, his breath fogging in front of him despite the warm summer night outside, and the smell intensified into something unmistakably rotten. At the bottom, he found himself in a small concrete room with bare walls and a low ceiling, empty except for a rusted metal chair bolted to the floor and a single chain attached to the wall beside it, the end of the chain disappearing into a dark stain that spread across the concrete like spilled ink. Jason stumbled backward, bile rising in his throat, when the door above slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging him into total darkness. He scrambled up the stairs, clawing at the door, but it wouldn't budge, as if something heavy had been dragged in front of it. Panic surged through him, raw and blinding, and he began pounding on the wood, shouting for help even though he knew no one could hear him at that hour. Then he felt it, a faint breath against the back of his neck, cold and damp, accompanied by the unmistakable sensation of fingers brushing lightly across his shoulder. He spun around, but the darkness was absolute. A voice whispered from inches away, hoarse and trembling, asking why he had come back. Jason's mind reeled, struggling to process the words, the implication that whoever or whatever was down there believed he didn't belong, that he was someone else, someone it had been waiting for. The voice grew louder, more desperate, accusing him of leaving, of locking the door, of pretending not to hear the screaming. Something grabbed his ankle, skeletal fingers tightening with impossible strength, dragging him down the stairs as he kicked and screamed, his nails tearing against the concrete in a futile attempt to stop. The door above burst open suddenly, light flooding the stairwell, and the grip vanished instantly, leaving him sprawled on the steps gasping for air. He bolted upward and slammed the door behind him, jamming a chair under the knob, his entire body shaking so violently he could barely stand. The next morning, he contacted the landlord demanding answers, but the man claimed there was no basement room, no staircase, insisting the house sat on a solid foundation. When Jason tried to show him, they found only a blank wall where the door had been, smooth plaster with no seams or hinges, as if it had never existed. Convinced he was losing his mind, Jason considered checking into a hotel. Yet something kept him there, a growing obsession with proving to himself that what he'd experienced was real. He began researching the property's history and discovered that decades earlier a family had lived there whose teenage son had vanished without a trace, last seen entering the house after school. The parents insisted he'd run away, but neighbors reported hearing screams coming from the upstairs for weeks afterward, screams that stopped abruptly the day the family moved out in the middle of the night. Jason tried to leave the house that same day, packing his car with essentials, but when he stepped into the hallway, the sealed door was back, standing exactly where it had been before, the paint scratched as if something inside had been clawing at it for years. A faint knocking echoed from within, slow and deliberate, followed by a weak voice calling his name, even though he had never spoken it aloud in that house. The doorknob began to turn from the inside, rattling violently, the wood bowing outward as if under immense pressure. Jason ran, abandoning everything, refusing to look back as the sound of splintering wood erupted behind him. He never returned, but months later when Emily finally joined him in a new apartment across town, she asked casually why he had written his name over and over on the inside of a door upstairs in the old house, carving it so deeply into the wood that it had nearly cut through. Jason felt the blood drain from his face as she showed him a photo she'd taken during a brief visit to collect the last of their belongings, a photo of that hallway with the door hanging open, revealing the dark staircase beyond, and his name scratched into every surface inside, as if someone trapped there had spent years trying to make sure he would come back and set them free.